The Last Stand of the Galactic Republic. Chapter 1, The Crown of Stars. The crystalline dome of the Imperial Senate stretched across the horizon of Celestia Prime, its faceted surface reflecting the light of 3 suns that had watched over the Galactic Empire for 1,000 years. Today, those same suns would witness either the continuation of democratic tradition or its violent end. General Joseph McLean stood at attention in the observation gallery, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the delegates file into the great chamber below. The election of the Emperor was supposed to be a ceremonial affair. The Senate would choose between 3 candidates, each representing different sectors of the galaxy, and the transition of power would be as smooth as the orbit of planets around their stars. But Joseph had lived through 47 years of military service, and he knew the difference between ceremony and the prelude to war. "Sir," whispered Lieutenant Commander Narration, appearing at his elbow with the quiet efficiency that had made her his most trusted aide. "Intelligence reports unusual troop movements in the Obsidian sector. Admiral Kronos has deployed 3 battle fleets without Senate authorization." Joseph's jaw tightened. Admiral Theon Kronos, former hero of the Andromedan Wars, now a man whose hunger for power had grown with each victory. The same man who now stood as one of the 3 candidates for Emperor. "How long until the voting begins?" Joseph asked. 30 minutes, sir." Below them, the Senate floor buzzed with activity. Representatives from 10,000 worlds had gathered, their diverse forms reflecting the magnificent tapestry of galactic civilization. Crystalline beings from the Silicon Nebula conversed with methane-breathing delegates from the Outer Rim, while humanoid species from the core worlds mingled with energy beings that existed as pure thought. Senator Elena Vasquez, the candidate Joseph personally supported, was deep in conversation with a group of Outer Rim representatives. She had built her campaign on promises of expanded trade rights and increased autonomy for distant worlds. A former diplomat with steel in her spine and wisdom in her eyes, she represented everything the Empire could be at its best. The third candidate, Governor Marcus Aurelius of the Inner Colonies, was a decent man but weak, the kind of leader who would maintain the status quo but never push the Empire toward greatness. And then there was Kronos. Joseph watched the Admiral move through the crowd like a predator sizing up prey. Tall and imposing, with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice, Kronos had the bearing of a man who had never met an obstacle he couldn't destroy. His supporters, mostly military personnel and industrialists from the war manufacturing sectors, formed a tight knot around him. "Sir," Chen's voice carried a note of urgency. "Coded transmission from Colonel Rivera in the military district. Security sensors are detecting weapons signatures in the Senate building." Joseph's blood turned to ice. "Impossible. The Senate chamber has the most sophisticated security grid in the galaxy. Nothing larger than a ceremonial blade should be able to." The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a heartbeat later, bathing the chamber in an eerie red glow. But in that moment of darkness, Joseph heard the distinctive whine of plasma weapons charging. "All delegates remain in your seats." Kronos' voice boomed across the chamber, amplified by hidden speakers. "By emergency decree, I am assuming command of this election under martial law provisions." Armored figures emerged from hidden alcoves throughout the Senate floor. Joseph counted at least 50 shock troopers, their black armor gleaming under the emergency lights. Each carried a plasma rifle that could cut through starship hull plating. "This is treason," Senator Vasquez's voice rang out clear and strong. "The Senate does not recognize your authority to." The plasma bolt that struck her podium left a smoking crater where she had been standing. She dove for cover behind her desk, but Joseph could see the determination in her eyes even from his position in the gallery. "The Empire stands at a crossroads," Kronos continued, his image now appearing on every display screen in the chamber. "For too long, we have been soft. We have allowed inferior species to drain our resources. We have permitted rebellion in the outer systems to go unpunished. Today, that ends." Joseph's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, but Chen grabbed his wrist. "Sir, look at the gallery entrances." More shock troopers had sealed every exit. The observation deck had become a cage. "The Senate will now vote to confirm me as Emperor," Kronos announced. Those who support the measure will signal their approval. Those who do not. Another plasma bolt, this one reducing Senator Aurelius's podium to slag. The governor himself had vanished. Whether he had escaped or been vaporized, Joseph couldn't tell. Vote, Kronos commanded. The delegates looked at each other in fear and confusion. Slowly, reluctantly, hands began to rise. Joseph watched in sick fascination as democracy died one terrified vote at a time. But not all hands rose. Senator Vasquez remained defiantly seated, as did perhaps 100 other delegates scattered throughout the chamber. Representatives of the Outer Rim worlds, mostly species that had fought for their independence before joining the Empire voluntarily. "I see we have some holdouts," Kronos said with cold amusement. "Very well. Let me demonstrate the consequences of defying the new order." The shock troopers opened fire. Joseph watched in horror as plasma bolts swept through the ranks of descending delegates. Beings who had dedicated their lives to peaceful discourse and democratic governance were cut down where they sat. The smell of ozone and burned flesh filled the air. Senator Vasquez was still alive, crouched behind an overturned desk with 3 other survivors. But shock troopers were advancing on their position. Joseph couldn't watch any longer. He drew his sidearm, an old military-issue plasma pistol, and fired at the nearest shock trooper in the gallery. The bolt caught the soldier in the back, dropping him instantly. "Sir," Chen hissed. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done the moment this started," Joseph replied, already moving toward the fallen trooper's position. "Defending the Republic." Chaos erupted in the observation gallery as other military officers followed Joseph's lead. The visiting civilians screamed and dove for cover as a firefight erupted overhead. Joseph reached the shock trooper's body and grabbed his rifle. The weapon was unfamiliar, newer than anything in the standard Imperial arsenal. As he examined it, his blood ran cold. The manufacturer's mark belonged to Kronos Industries, the Admiral's private military contracting firm. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment coup. This had been planned for months, maybe years. "Chen," he called over the sound of weapons fire. "Get to the emergency communicator. Send word to Admiral Harrison at Fleet Command. Tell her what's happening here." "Sir, the communication grid is jammed. Nothing's getting out." Of course it was. Kronos had thought of everything. Joseph looked down at the Senate floor, where the last pockets of resistance were being systematically eliminated. Senator Vasquez was still fighting, using an ornamental energy weapon she'd pulled from somewhere, but she was outnumbered 10-1. "We have to get down there," Joseph said. "Sir, that's suicide. There are 50 shock troopers between us and..." "Elena Vasquez is the legitimate heir to the Imperial throne," Joseph interrupted. "If she dies, any hope of restoring democratic rule dies with her." Chen looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "What's the plan?" Joseph studied the gallery's architecture. The observation deck was connected to the main floor by a series of maintenance shafts that ran through the building's support structure. They'd be cramped and dangerous, but they might provide a way to reach the Senate floor undetected. "Emergency protocols," he said. "When the power grid failed, the building's blast shutters should have sealed automatically. But they didn't, which means Kronos had them disabled. That also means the maintenance systems are offline. The air recycling shafts," Chen breathed. "They'd be unpowered but passable." "Exactly. Get word to the other officers. We go down in small groups, hit the shock troopers from behind, and extract the survivors." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. 20 minutes later, Joseph found himself crawling through a ventilation shaft that had never been designed for human passage. Behind him, Chen and Lieutenant Torres struggled to keep up as they navigated the maze of ducts and conduits that formed the Senate building's circulatory system. The shaft opened onto a utility closet 3 levels down, just off the main Senate floor. Joseph could hear weapons fire and shouted commands echoing through the walls. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. "Survivors in the West Wing. Eliminate them." "Yes, sir." "What about the observers?" Kill anyone who resisted. The rest can be processed later. Joseph's jaw clenched. Processed. As if the people in that gallery were cargo to be sorted. He cracked the door open and peered out. The corridor was empty except for 2 shock troopers standing guard at the entrance to the Senate chamber. Their backs were turned, they were watching the slaughter inside, not expecting threats from behind. Joseph held up 2 fingers to Chen and Torres, then pointed at the guards. They nodded understanding. The attack was swift and silent. Joseph and Torres took the guards down with precise plasma shots while Chen secured their weapons. Within seconds, they had a clear path to the Senate floor. But what Joseph saw when he looked through the chamber doors made his heart sink. The Great Hall was a charnel house. Hundreds of delegates lay dead or dying among their overturned desks. The shock troopers were moving systematically through the survivors, executing anyone who showed signs of resistance. And at the center of it all, Admiral Kronos stood on the raised platform where the Emperor's throne waited, his arms spread wide as if embracing the carnage. "Citizens of the Empire," he was saying, his voice carried by speakers throughout the building and presumably across the galaxy. "Today marks the beginning of a new age. An age of strength. An age of purity. An age where the weak will no longer drag down the strong." Joseph spotted Senator Vasquez near the south wall, pinned down behind a fallen column with perhaps a dozen other survivors. Shock troopers were closing in on their position from 3 sides. "We have to move now," he whispered to his team. They entered the chamber low and fast, using the scattered debris for cover. Joseph's first shot took down a shock trooper who was advancing on Vasquez's position. His second caught another soldier in the shoulder, spinning him around and exposing him to return fire from the surviving delegates. But their intervention had been noticed. A squad of shock troopers turned toward them, plasma rifles rising. "Get to cover!" Joseph shouted, diving behind an overturned desk as enemy fire lit up the air around him. The wood and metal provided minimal protection against military-grade weapons, but it was better than nothing. Chen and Torres had found their own cover nearby, and they began laying down suppressing fire to keep the shock troopers from advancing. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. That's when the real cavalry arrived. The main doors to the Senate chamber burst open, and a squad of Imperial Marines poured through. Joseph recognized their leader immediately, Colonel Maria Santos, one of the finest soldiers he'd ever served with. "For the Republic!" Santos shouted, her assault rifle chattering as she led her Marines in a flanking attack against the shock troopers. The battle turned into a 3-way firefight, with Kronos' forces caught between the surviving Loyalists and Santos' Marines. But the Admiral's troops had superior numbers and heavier weapons. "Santos!" Joseph called out during a brief lull in the firing. "How many Marines do you have?" "2 squads," she replied, not taking her eyes off the enemy positions. "The rest of the garrison has been compromised." Kronos had agents throughout the command structure. Joseph's heart sank. 2 squads of Marines, perhaps 30 soldiers, against what looked like 100 shock troopers, with more probably on the way. But then Senator Vasquez's voice cut through the chaos. "General McLean. Colonel Santos. Fall back to the emergency bunker. We need to regroup and coordinate a proper resistance." The emergency bunker was a hardened command post built into the Senate building's foundation, designed to protect government officials during times of crisis. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to organize a counterattack. "Cover me," Joseph told Chen and Torres. He broke from cover and sprinted toward Vasquez's position, plasma bolts searing the air around him. He dove behind the column just as a volley of shots reduced his previous hiding spot to splinters. "Senator," he said, breathing hard. "Are you injured?" "Just my pride," Vasquez replied grimly. "Joseph, listen to me. Kronos has been planning this for years. He has sleeper agents throughout the military and government. We can't trust anyone." "How do you know?" "Because 3 days ago, one of his agents tried to recruit me. Offered me a position in his new government if I withdrew from the election." Her eyes blazed with fury. "I told him where he could put his offer. Joseph almost smiled despite the circumstances. Elena Vasquez had always been too stubborn for her own good. "The emergency bunker," he said. "Can we reach it?" "There's a service corridor behind that wall." She pointed to a section of paneling that looked identical to the rest. "But we need to get the other survivors there too." Joseph looked around the chamber. Santos and her Marines were holding their own, but barely. The other survivors, maybe 20 delegates and staff members, were scattered throughout the chamber, pinned down by overlapping fields of fire. "We'll have to move in groups," he decided. "You take the first group through the corridor. I'll stay here and help Santos extract the rest." "Joseph." "That's an order, Senator. You're the legitimate emperor now. Your survival is more important than any of ours." For a moment, Vasquez looked like she wanted to argue. Then she nodded. "Don't you dare die on me, General. I'm going to need you to help rebuild this mess." She gathered the closest survivors and led them toward the hidden corridor. Joseph watched them disappear through what turned out to be a concealed door, then turned his attention back to the battle. Santos was pinned down near the main entrance, her Marines taking heavy casualties. Joseph could see at least 6 bodies in Imperial uniforms scattered around her position. "Chen, Torres," he called to his aides. "We're going to help extract the Marines. Follow my lead." They moved carefully through the debris-strewn chamber, using the chaos of battle to mask their approach. Joseph reached Santos's position just as she was calling for a tactical withdrawal. "Colonel," he said, dropping down beside her. "We have an escape route. Emergency bunker." "Thank God," Santos replied. "I've lost half my people, and we're almost out of ammunition. Can you get your Marines to the west wall? There's a hidden corridor behind the paneling." Santos nodded and began issuing orders to her surviving troops. One by one, the Marines began falling back, covering each other as they moved toward the escape route. But Kronos had noticed the withdrawal. Joseph heard the Admiral's voice booming across the chamber, "They're trying to escape. All units, converge on the west wall." Suddenly, the area around the hidden corridor became a killing zone as shock troopers concentrated their fire on the Marines' escape route. 2 more Marines fell before they could reach safety. "We need a distraction," Santos said grimly. Joseph looked around the chamber, his tactical mind racing. They needed something that would draw the shock troopers' attention away from the escape route long enough for the Marines to get through. His eyes fell on the Emperor's throne, still standing on its raised platform at the center of the chamber. If he could reach it, if he could make enough noise. "Cover me," he told Santos, then broke from concealment before she could object. Joseph sprinted across the chamber toward the throne platform, zigzagging to avoid the plasma bolts that immediately began tracking him. He dove, rolled, and came up firing, his shots more meant to draw attention than to hit specific targets. "Come on," he shouted at the shock troopers. "You want to kill the general who beat you at Proxima Centauri? Here I am." It worked. Most of the enemy fire shifted toward him, giving Santos and her Marines the opening they needed to reach the escape corridor. But Joseph found himself trapped on the throne platform, surrounded by hostile forces. That's when he noticed the control panel built into the throne's armrest. Emergency protocols for the Senate building, including something labeled Planetary Defense Grid Interface. Joseph's eyes widened. The Senate building wasn't just a government center, it was also the command nexus for Celestia Prime's orbital defense network. If he could access those controls. He slapped his palm against the biometric scanner, hoping his general's clearance was still valid. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the panel lit up with tactical displays showing the positions of defense satellites throughout the planet's orbital space. "Warning," the computer announced in a calm feminine voice. "Unauthorized military vessels detected in restricted airspace. Recommend immediate defensive action." Joseph looked at the tactical display. Kronos' fleet was positioned around the planet, but they were still showing Imperial identification codes. The defense grid was treating them as friendlies. But Joseph had override authority as a general officer. With a few quick commands, he reclassified Kronos' ships as hostile vessels. Defense grid activated, the computer announced. Engaging hostile targets. Through the building's transparent dome, Joseph could see brilliant flashes of light in the sky as orbital weapons platforms opened fire on Kronos' fleet. It wouldn't be enough to destroy them, the Admiral's ships were too powerful and too numerous, but it would certainly get their attention. Impressive, General, Kronos' voice said behind him. But ultimately futile. Joseph spun around to find the Admiral standing at the edge of the platform, flanked by a dozen shock troopers. Up close, Kronos looked even more intimidating, tall and broad-shouldered, with scars that spoke of real combat experience. The defense grid can't reach my primary fleet, Kronos continued. And even if it could, you've only delayed the inevitable. The Empire will be reborn in strength, with or without your cooperation. The Empire was already strong, Joseph replied, his hand moving slowly toward his sidearm. Strong enough to protect 1,000 worlds, to welcome dozens of species, to maintain peace across the galaxy. What you're building isn't an empire, it's a tyranny. Kronos smiled coldly. Peace is stagnation, General. Order requires discipline. And discipline requires that the weak be separated from the strong. And who decides who's weak and who's strong? You? Evolution decides. Natural selection. The strong survive and prosper, while the weak are eliminated. Kronos gestured toward the corpse-strewn Senate floor. These delegates thought they could govern through talk and compromise. They were wrong. Joseph's hand was almost to his weapon. Just a few more inches. Don't, Kronos said mildly. My soldiers have their weapons trained on you. Move toward your pistol and you'll be dead before you can draw it. Joseph looked around at the shock troopers and realized the Admiral was right. He was surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. But he wasn't out of time. Tell me something, Kronos, Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber. This grand plan of yours, rebuilding the Empire through strength and natural selection, how exactly do you plan to implement it? Kronos looked puzzled by the question, but his ego was too large to resist explaining. Simple. The strong worlds will be incorporated into my new order. The weak ones will be purged. I estimate that eliminating roughly half of the current Imperial worlds will provide sufficient resources and Lebensraum for a truly superior civilization. Half the galaxy, Joseph said, making sure his voice carried to the hidden recorders that were still functioning throughout the building. Even if Kronos controlled the communication grid, the Senate's internal recording systems were independently powered and nearly impossible to disable completely. You're talking about genocide on an unimaginable scale. I'm talking about evolution, Kronos replied. The trimming of dead branches so that the tree of civilization can grow stronger. Joseph filed that confession away for future use, assuming he lived long enough to make use of it. But he had bought enough time for Santos and the others to escape. That would have to be enough. I suppose you think I'm going to beg for my life now, Joseph said. The thought had occurred to me. But I know you better than that, General. You're going to stand there and glare at me with righteous indignation until my soldiers put you out of your misery. Actually, Joseph said, I was thinking about something else entirely. He reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, making sure the shock troopers could see he wasn't going for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small silver pendant, a memento from his first command. My grandfather gave this to me when I graduated from the academy, Joseph said. He fought in the War of Unification, back when the Empire was still young. He used to tell me stories about the early days, when democracy was just an experiment and nobody was sure it would work. How touching, Kronos said dryly. Is there a point to this reminiscence? The point, Joseph said, is that my grandfather never lived to see the Empire reach its full potential. He died believing that maybe, just maybe, we could build something better than the petty kingdoms and military dictatorships that came before. Joseph looked directly at Kronos, his voice growing stronger. He was right. We did build something better. And men like you will never destroy it, no matter how many of us you kill. Noble words, Kronos replied. But ultimately meaningless. History is written by the victors, General. And I have already won. Have you? Joseph asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're so afraid of democracy that you had to stage a coup to avoid losing an election. For the first time, Kronos' composure cracked slightly. I saved the Empire from weak leadership. You saved yourself from irrelevance. There's a difference. Kronos' eyes flashed with anger. Enough. You've had your moment of defiance. Now. The explosion came from somewhere deep in the building, strong enough to shake the Senate chamber and send dust raining from the ceiling. Emergency alarms began wailing as additional detonations echoed through the structure. Sir, one of the shock troopers called out. Explosions in the lower levels. Structural damage to the foundation. Kronos cursed and activated his communication device. Command, report. Sir, we're detecting multiple explosions throughout the government district. Someone is targeting critical infrastructure. Joseph smiled grimly. Elena Vasquez wasn't just a politician, she was also a former intelligence operative who knew how to fight dirty when necessary. The emergency bunker wouldn't just be a hiding place, it would be a command center for resistance operations. Find them, Kronos snarled into his communicator. Find them and kill them all. But another explosion, this one closer, sent several shock troopers staggering. The building's lights flickered, and Joseph could hear the distinctive whine of failing power systems. Sir, the trooper called again, we need to evacuate. The building's structural integrity is compromised. Kronos looked around the chamber, his carefully planned triumph turning into chaos. Very well. Prepare the general for transport. He'll make a useful bargaining chip. 2 shock troopers moved toward Joseph, energy restraints in hand. But before they could reach him, another explosion, this one directly below the Senate chamber, sent a massive crack racing across the dome overhead. And in that moment of confusion, Joseph saw his chance. He grabbed the silver pendant and activated the hidden transmitter inside, a personal emergency beacon that all general officers carried. It would send a coded signal to any Imperial forces within range, marking his position and requesting immediate assistance. But more importantly, it would transmit his personal authentication codes, proving that at least one high-ranking loyalist was still alive on Celestia Prime. The shock troopers reached him just as the transmitter finished its broadcast. Joseph didn't resist as they bound his hands, he had accomplished what he needed to accomplish. Sir, the lead trooper reported to Kronos, the general was transmitting. Unknown frequency and destination. Kronos' eyes narrowed dangerously. What did you send, General? Wedding anniversary reminder to my wife, Joseph replied blandly. She gets very upset when I forget important dates. For a moment, Joseph thought Kronos might execute him on the spot. But the admiral was too smart for that. A dead general was just a corpse, but a living one could be interrogated, used as leverage, or turned into a propaganda symbol. Move out, Kronos ordered. We'll continue this conversation on my flagship. As the shock troopers marched Joseph toward the chamber's exit, he took one last look around the Senate hall where democracy had died. But even as he grieved for the fallen delegates, he felt a spark of hope. Elena Vasquez was alive and free. Santos and her Marines had escaped. And somewhere in the government district, bombs were going off in a coordinated pattern that suggested serious military planning. The coup had succeeded, but the war was just beginning.